So here's the question: is an evolutionary understanding of sociality useful for psychiatry? And I'm not certain. We'll all discuss this at the end. I think it might be a mistake to try to talk with clinicians about the origins of relationships. We'll see. Background about other people. I said yesterday, the origins of everything. It's not just Nesse. It's a lot of other folks, especially Michael McGuire, who in 1964 wrote about ethology in psychiatry. 10 years later, he did it again, edited the journal that became the Journal for the Human Behavior and Evolution Society. Brent Winograd, also at Stanford, 1984, wrote a wonderful book about sociology and mental disorder. He meant sociobiology and mental disorder. My first paper was in 1984, after all these folks, but I point out that evolutionary psychiatry came before evolutionary medicine. George Williams and I wrote in 1991 and 1994, and it was this paper that made George take me kind of seriously as a potential collaborator. And then there's Dick Alexander, who inspired many of us at University of Michigan. I'm especially glad that Bernie Crespi and Mark Flynn are here. His biology of moral systems was revelatory for me. He asked me, please take a look at this for me, Randy. And since he had read on every single page of one of my papers, I did the same for him, and it led to a good relationship. Robin says, friendship is the most important thing. This is the first thing that comes up on Google, and there's no way to find this actual article because I think it's only a one-paragraph article, but you really must put that up someplace. What isn't emphasized, though, are the different kinds of relationships. Kin relationships, very, very close ones, communal relationships, and instrumental relationships. And in psychiatry and in social psychology, we really emphasize that some relationships are explicitly about exchanges. Others are based on emotion and commitment. So we know that relationships are central to everything, especially in psychiatry, relationships in psychotherapy and mental problems. But the question I'm posing is, why do they exist at all? Now I get to show you some pretty pictures. The boat party is so wonderful, isn't it? I mean, this is just people having a great time together, enjoying their friends. And sometimes it leads to this. Romeo and Juliet, and shortly after that comes this wonderful phase of life. Shortly after that, life becomes a little bit different. Then there's guy stuff. Julius Caesar, who's going to get the guy who's the dictator? It's supposedly his best friend. And here's a young man, the young man syndrome, like Martin Daly and Margaret Wilson talked about. They just fought about who was going to cross first at the crossroads. And this young guy kills the old guy, and of course this is Oedipus. Did that work out? Not so well. There's Oedipus and his daughter Antigone wander through Thebes after they've caused the plague, killing everyone. Gets worse. She wanders off with him, maybe because they share 3/4 of their genes, but I don't think so. What really I find most impressive about all of this, though, is when she goes to her brother, Patroclus, and the king has said, anybody who touches that body is going to get killed. And she says, I need to anoint his body anyhow. Kill me if you must. That's not to maximize gene transmission, folks. There's something about commitment. There's something about morality. And the fact that this is so explicit and made such central piece of Greek literature is amazing. 4 parts to talk with you about. First is the traumatic insight, which really, I was sleepless for weeks after learning it. What we know about relationships, explanations for morality and commitment from an evolutionary perspective, and implications for clinicians. So what's the traumatic insight? I think you all already know. Natural selection maximizes gene transmission, even at the expense of individual and group welfare. So this is a question. Why do individuals make sacrifices? We obviously see we all do this. The old answer was it helps the groups. Well, everybody believed that. It's unbelievable in retrospect that almost all biologists believed that this was the explanation. Then George Williams, my friend and colleague in 1966, wrote Adaptation to Natural Selection, and he simply pointed out with ruthless logic that benefits to groups can't explain tendencies to help groups. Indeed, because individuals who sacrifice more than others in the group will have fewer offspring. I love Gary Larson's cartoon. Do lemons commit suicide for the group because offing yourself will leave enough food for the species to survive? No, it's not possible because that guy who's not cooperating is the one who's going to survive and pass on his genes. Again, the magnitude of this changed view is overwhelming. And for me, I started seeing it everywhere. I used to go into a forest and see these marvelous trees, all a part of marvelous Gaia, wonderful nature. What a wasteful thing is how I see it now. Why on earth are all these trees so big and wasting so much effort trying to make cellulose? They could all be about 3 feet tall and harvest just as much sunlight, but they don't, even if they're the same species. Why? It's because selection doesn't work for the group. Selection is maximizing gene transmission. I think this is as disturbing an insight as the Copernican and Darwinian revolutions. It's just deeply, deeply disturbing. People didn't really catch on to this until Dawkins wrote The Selfish Gene. And although it's not as bleak officially, but he ends the book by saying, now that we know that we're all basically selfish, maybe we can do something about it. That's really quite a bleak view after all. He left a lot of people feeling like genuine altruism just is not possible. And George Williams and I will just read what he has to say about this. It's undoubtedly true that many of the ethical systems that are preached, and sometimes practiced, sly irony there, are thoroughly unselfish and genuinely altruistic. This means that the benign motivations that underlie them cannot have been directly favored by natural selection. They must have been produced indirectly by some sort of accident, the sort of thing that happens routinely in evolution. On an evolutionary timescale, natural selection is immensely powerful, but it's also abysmally stupid. It's utterly indifferent. Whoa. And Dick Alexander had a very similar view of life. And I remember him talking about going to his mentor and saying, I have an example of altruism. I didn't step on a worm when I came into the building. And he told the story over and over again. Yes, it was altruistic until you told me about it. And then Bob Trivers was, the most cynical of all, believing that there's no such possibility of altruism. You're just tricking yourself and manipulating people by pretending to be altruistic. I found this so disturbing, first personally, and because of my background with grandfathers as missionaries and the like. But I think almost everybody also finds it inconsistent with their daily experience. I mean, look at this conference and the work that Molly and other people have done to help us all. And it's astounding that you look around you, people do these marvelous, generous things. So I tried to cope with this and wrote a chapter for the book on the 30th anniversary of The Selfish Gene about why so many people with selfish genes are generally nice, except that they hate the selfish gene. And this is really a psychoanalytic paper about the emotional reactions people have to the selfish gene. Some say, I knew it all along, thank God. Other people say, oh, this is obviously wrong. It's fascinating. I think it's an illusion, and instead of just arguing with people more about group selection, we need to ask about why is it that this idea persists, even though it really doesn't make sense. We know that individuals do costly things that benefit groups, and it appears so obvious that it must be those benefits that shape the trait, because we haven't had another kind of explanation. But it can't be possible, so what is the possible explanation? West, and they publish another paper every year trying to set the world straight about this. But the bottom line is we don't have any examples of traits that decrease inclusive fitness that benefit groups. There just are no examples. So have the smartest people in the world gotten together and resolved this? No. This is just one example. Steve Pinker wrote an essay to try to set the world straight, saying the false allure of group selection. And Richard Dawkins and Jerry Coyne and Peter Church and lots of other people said, go for it, let's set the world straight. And then these other really smart people, Joe Henrich and Jonathan Haidt, Rob Boyd, Sarah Matthew, say, no, you guys have missed the boat. There's this. That's so interesting. Whenever you get so many people disagreeing who are smart and well-educated, there's something wrong. Something's missing. And is there any other way of solving this problem? I call this the altruism wars. And people are not especially nice to each other. I talk about constructive engagement. There's a lot of misrepresentation of other positions and bad stuff going on here. So what about us as clinicians and as evolutionary scientists in the clinical realm? What are we supposed to do about this? Some people, with support from the Templeton Foundation, I'll emphasize, say go with group selection, because obviously groups are important and it makes everything nicer. Others accept that we're all fundamentally selfish, and one of the leading emotions researchers I talked with recently said, well, one thing psychotherapists can do if nothing else works is tell our patients, well, you just have to accept that everybody's selfish. I think this is a very disturbing thing to tell people. First of all, I've noticed that neurotics outnumber sociopaths 10 to 1, and the belief that everybody is self-interested is self-fulfilling. If you believe that, people who are generous and trusting aren't going to mess with you. The belief that love is illusion is self-fulfilling. And schemas are so hard to change. If you have a patient who was raised in a family that had no trust and their patients were drinkers or erratic some way, it can take years to try to have a trusting relationship with that patient. Very difficult. I'm worried that a selfish gene thinking can actually be a toxic meme that can be corrosive to the social fabric. And I've even wondered if that idea might be responsible for some of what we're seeing in society these days. Here's a nice quote. The beliefs that people hold about one another and the way that their behavior translates into social consequences would be central to cooperation. Societies can tip from cooperation to conflict just because of a mere change in beliefs. That's very disturbing if, in fact, people take this apparently scientific view of everything to be self-interest, and that actually ruins the capacity for cooperation. There's lots of evidence on this. Bob Frank has done a nice study about before and after a course in economics. And guess what? Take one course in economics and it will make you a more selfish person. So this is the mystery. Group selection cannot explain altruism for non-kin, but many people are altruistic and have moral passions. And they do things like Antigone, spreading ointment on her brother's body. And capacities for morality in committed relationships are not well explained. So now part two. There's so many different explanations. I mean, the greatest scientific advance, I think, in the late 20th century was understanding sociality. It's just astounding. There are mutualisms, kin selection, reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, cultural group selection, enforcement. I'm going to give each huge area one slide and then move past. Mutualisms, a lot of them look like they're altruism, but both organisms are doing what's best for them, and it works out well for both of them. Grand. Kin selection, Bill Hamilton's deep insight that doing things for other people who share a portion of genes identical by descent can lead to genuine altruism, where the individual sacrifices personal, direct reproductive success in ways that increase indirect fitness. Reciprocity has been the subject of huge numbers of studies. Bob Trivers pioneered this, and Bob Axelrod is the person who did the studies. You should review the literature. There are now 144,000 articles that are about prisoner's dilemma and this topic. And this, I think, that's why this has been so popular, partly. You can sick a student on it and do a project in a few months and publish it. But again, these are transactional relationships based on the assumption that everybody's doing what maximizes their personal benefit. I wrote an article based on this that's been very useful to clinicians, many people tell me, by pointing out that the boxes of the prisoner's dilemma, that it seems that natural selection has shaped emotions, each one, to cope with that particular kind of situation. Then there's indirect reciprocity and reputation. Dick Alexander's book, The Biology of Moral Systems, I think got most of this going. And Noack and Sigmund, subsequently doing their weird kind of group selection. Gentis and Bowles, there's a lot of people who recognize that your reputation is a valuable social resource and you better protect it because somehow or another it influences how much people will help you. Then there's cultural group selection, the idea that groups that have more individuals who have the cultural norm of cooperating within the group do better than other groups and displace them, which certainly happens. That's Rob Boyd, Pete Richardson, and Joe Henrich. And most recently, and I think of unappreciated power, is enforcement. And for me, this became more prominent from Kevin Foster's lab studying behavior of bacteria cooperating. In particular, Arvid Argren, who I've been working with, has a nice article about enforcement being central to the evolution of cooperation. Bob Axelrod and a lot of other people have said, you can't get enforcement because it's expensive. How can you get somebody to be the person who tells somebody else to pick up litter because the other person might shoot you, so you don't tell the people to pick up the litter? But they point out that a lot of enforcement is costless. And I think that simple phrase is going to become central. If you can do costless enforcement, that can be a very powerful source of cooperation. But still left unexplained for all of this are capacities for genuine morality and love and commitment. And many people take the fact that these capacities cannot be explained by those other origins that I just mentioned to say, well, it must be group selection or cultural group selection. Nothing else can explain it. For the big cultural group selection article in Behavior and Brain Sciences a few years ago, that was their explicit argument. So the other things can't explain it, it must be, but there's an alternative. So this is part 3, explanations for moral passions and committed relationships, both commitment and groups, and social selection. So I spent several years on the theory of commitment, mathematical theories behind mutually assured destruction. The idea is that if you can convince others that you're going to do something in the future that won't be in your interest then, you both can get a big advantage, promising things like, till death do us part, in sickness and in health. If you can convince somebody that you're good for that, and they can convince you, you can have a relationship that gives you benefits that no other relationship can possibly give you. But the other side of this is threatening to harm someone in the future. And so threats of spiteful harm, and the mob doesn't want to burn down your bar or your restaurant, but every once in a while they have to do it to convince you to make the protection money payment. I tried to do some research on this, and it turned out that we kept talking to these people about, have you had experiences of this? Mostly it was people in small religious groups with high costs of entry. So I'm not going to say more about this now. The main thing is social selection. The essence of social selection is when social choices are selection forces. Mate choice is the obvious one. That's a subcategory of social selection. Social partner choice for cooperators. Choosing and being chosen, staying versus leaving. Notice this is not just all choosing the best amongst a possible range of possible altruists. This is any kind of social choice, including signaling, don't choose me. Why are those impala starting? It's because that demonstration makes it so that no predator is going to chase them. They'll chase somebody else who's an easier prey, another product of social selection. So I finally got onto this. I kept racking my brain and literally staying up nights saying there must be some solution. I kept coming back to Mary Jean West-Eberhard's work. She's an insect biologist, also from Michigan, but not part of this group that we were a part of so much. And finally, after 10 years, I read her papers for the third time and recognized what she was saying about social selection, that it's sexual selection is a subtype. Hammerstein and Noe did partner choice from an economic point of view. Steve Frank has most recently written this and made it all very sensible. Bottom line, human moral capacities are as costly and extravagant as a peacock's tail. I would call this the invisible hand with a reference to Adam Smith, because all of the choices involved are self-interested. Individuals make self-interested choices of who the best possible groups to join and social partners are available. And what does this do? It pairs altruists with altruists. And they both get big advantages, resulting in selection for traits that make one a desirable partner, such as altruism, generosity, empathy, honesty, and loyalty. But the other part of this is that people are not just looking for individuals who have good character. They're also looking for other individuals who are rich, have high social status and power. So there's lots of work on this now, not pulled together very well and not very widely known. Dick Alexander was close to this view. Takana, Steve, my first article was in 2001, then 2006 and 2008. I'll come to that in a second. These are if you want to read just 2 articles, there's a most recent one by Bernie Crespi and Mark and Kyle. Bernie and Mark are here, and we'll probably have more to say in a minute. My article with the mathematical models is 2007. Here's Wolf's model, which I think is really excellent. He points out that
these are your traits here and here, and what traits you have influence who chooses you as a partner. And that traits in that partner contributes to your fitness, either positive or negative. So your traits influence your partners. What partners you have influence your fitness. Not that complicated. My model showed a successive pairing of partners and a somewhat randomized payoff matrix, such that at each iteration, individuals got resources proportionate to which partners they chose, and the ones that chose the best partners got the best payoffs. And by the time you went to 15 iterations, everybody was paired up so that the best had the best partners and were making the most, and the worst had the worst partners. Let's skip that one. Again, this is more than just choosing the best partner. It's also being rejected, because this is costless enforcement. If you're in a relationship with somebody and you just say, this isn't working, you just kind of ghost them, that's a social choice, and this happens a lot. Best example in nature, flowers. Why are flowers so beautiful? Why do they spend so much effort on making pollen and nectar and scent and color? And the answer is they're competing. They're competing to be the most attractive to the pollinators. The other super example is legume rhizobia, a symbiosis. The bacteria in these nodules on root hairs make nitrogen, which the plant needs, and they give the plant, and vice versa, glucose is transferred to them. And the plant can at any time drop off one of those nodules by cutting it off. And likewise, right, the bacterial nodules can say, plant isn't giving me enough glucose, I'm out of here. So this is a social choice, creating an extraordinary partnership that is essential for both of them later. In humans, what do we see? We see choosing or losing mates. We're all on committees all the time in universities. Which person should we hire for our group? Or which person should we try to get out of the department? Constantly. This is what we do. And these are self-interested choices by the groups and by individuals, but they end up creating substantial forces for cooperation. So Robin comes back to how many friends does one person need? And the answer is as many as can be managed, which is 150, depending on how close those friendships are, especially those who have resources and will share them with you, because people don't just choose friends at random. So what social selection shapes? I think it shapes competitive altruism. There's a lot of data now showing that people will pay money for opportunities to display their altruism, which is hard to explain with other theories. Conspicuous consumption, grand potlatches, or like that wedding in India just last week that spent more than the entire budget of many provinces. Moral passions, empathy, social anxiety, but the part for psychiatry is we're also damn sensitive to what other people think about us. We're monitoring every minute. Did that person look at me wrong? And it's really a problem. We care so much what other people think. And this is what I call the seamy side or the sordid side of social selection. I mean, I went into this thinking, oh, altruists pair with altruists. Good for them because they're good people and they deserve it. Think more deeply. This ends up also with those who don't have much to offer being at the bottom of the pyramid. And there's not much for them. They don't have much to offer. Nobody chooses them. And this leads to the worst kind of hierarchy. So why is this all neglected if it's so true and obvious? I think it's neglected because of preoccupation with kin selection versus group selection, but most of all because it's not intuitive. I mean, the idea that self-interested choices can create selection for truly prosocial moral capacities just is beyond reckoning for most people. Also, it doesn't generate thousands or hundreds of thousands of easy studies so people can get degrees and publish. And it also doesn't support simplistic liberal or conservative ideologies. So clinical applications of all of this. First, understanding disorders, understanding relationships, and managing therapeutic relationships. I spent much of my career treating social anxiety. First half I thought, what's wrong with these people? Then gradually I started recognizing that social anxiety was useful, and I started telling my patients, you know what, you suffer terribly from this, we're going to try to help you, but please realize there's something worse, and that is not having any social anxiety. And those people don't come from treatment, but they're really annoying to be around. Then there's neurosis. And what are the benefits of neurosis? The high empathy, constantly being attuned to what other people think, trying to please other people. But the costs are being very sensitive to criticism, attracting exploiters, leading to cynicism, and anxiety, depression, shame, and guilt. This is some concrete data about genetic studies. This is Kendler's famous study looking at different classifications of disorders. Turns out, no matter how you do it, there are two global kinds of mental disorders. Internalizing ones, where you're looking at yourself and blaming yourself for things, and externalizing ones, where you tend to take advantage of other people, often without knowing it, including sociopathy and alcohol use and impulsive behavior and all the rest. Fascinating that even the genetic studies and our fundamental diagnostic system helps to be explained by this perspective. Sociopathy, Linda Mealy, about 20 years ago, wrote a famous article about the possibility that it was sustained by frequency-dependent selection, so that you could take advantage of people if there weren't too many cheaters in the population, but then as you got more, people got more suspicious. I don't think her argument actually works, but it's a marvelous example of how negative frequency-dependent selection could possibly work. Then there's borderline personality disorder. These folks get into a nasty positive feedback cycle because they're desperate for deep relationships. They promise you a committed, moral, you are the best person in the world relationship. But pretty soon they want to be reassured that you're going to stick with them through thick and thin. And you can never provide that kind of reassurance enough. And then they get really mad at you. And then the whole relationship breaks, which confirms their basic view that people are not trustworthy. It's a nasty kind of positive feedback cycle that leads to personality problems. Back to this fundamental distinction between transactional and communal relationships. This is where I think the rubber meets the road, and we have to be careful about talking about these ideas with patients, because it's so easy to start talking about relationships as if they're transactional. And here's one example of why I think we should be cautious. One of my mentors sat me down, and he was teaching me how to do behavior therapy or marital therapy. And he said, what we do, Randy, is we go to the patients and we ask the woman and the man each about what they expect from the relationship and what they give to the relationship, have them write it all down, and then we renegotiate the marital contract. So everybody decides what they're expected to do and what they expect of the other person. This didn't work. I mean, it worked to bring the patients together, the marriage together, in their agreement that these psychiatrists were really out to lunch because they didn't understand how marriages actually worked based on emotion and commitment and all the rest. Marriage is right at the center of all these kin, non-kin, transactional, committed relationships, which is why it's so complicated. What about therapeutic relationships? I found these ideas very helpful as a psychotherapist, because constantly you were talking with people about, is the patients say, I'm paying you, so how can you actually care? That's in every therapeutic relationship. And it's a delicate matter. It's a real issue. And I think understanding these kind of things we're talking about is helpful. Likewise, trust. How do you develop trust? Jerome Frank, written about 200 therapies. He said, what do they all have in common? He says, well, any therapy will work so long as it has a theory and a procedure, some expectation by both the patient and clinician that it'll work, and a therapeutic relationship. Since then, this has become a large area of research. People looking at whether the kind of therapy predicts outcomes or the relationship predicts outcomes. And here's the bottom line. Treatment differences, categories of therapy, account for less than 1% of the variability in outcomes, and the actual characteristics of the therapeutic relationship are far, far more powerful. Seeing similar data in another study, more recent, looking at the effect size for relationship factors versus methodologies, and treatment differences, what treatment you sign up for, cognitive behavioral therapy or interpersonal therapy or anything. Not very powerful, but the nature of the relationship is very powerful. This is an unexplored area of study. How do relationships help? There's empathic understanding, addressing problems, reframing events I think is powerful. The best therapists, I think, do it intuitively. And whether or not the kinds of things I'm talking about can help or interfere with their intuition, I think is a good question. So the conclusions from all of this are that understanding the origins of human sociality as a foundation should be helpful. Most relationships are well explained. Capacities for morality and commitment, I think, can be explained by social selection, but that idea is not very widespread yet. But those capacities leave us vulnerable to low self-esteem and social anxiety. About clinicians, well, I'm eager for your discussion. I'm worried that doing this in a simplistic way is going to be harmful, not helpful, and very curious to hear what you think about that. Thank you very much.